Alrighty, for week 4. This week you're looking at chapters 8 and 9, essentially the early days of the Republic following the war. So here's what the country's looking like after England recognizes American independence and the war officially ends with the Treaty of Paris. You can see some areas are under dispute between the Spanish. Spanish got Florida back during the war, and that's really significant. Canada remains British. That's significant because the British will continue to sort of try and lay claim to parts of, say, Vermont. You can see there's a dispute there in Maine, areas here. You can see the Russians are starting to encroach into the Northwest. That's going to be significant in future years as well. So that's the lay of the land. The government is now officially a republic, which means there's no more king, and the people are going to try and rule themselves if they can. We do not yet have the U.S. Constitution. That comes at the end of Chapter 8 and moving into Chapter 9 is all about the government under the Constitution. This early government following the war was under the Articles of Confederation. A confederation is a system in which you bring together separate governments, in this case the 13 separate states, and a sort of loose cooperation between them. But that's the problem with the Articles, is it didn't create a strong centralized federal government. The power was in the states versus the national government. There's no executive, so there's no president per se under the Articles. The president under the Articles was the president of the Congress. The Congress was really the only branch of government under the Articles of Confederation. Make laws and policies, but very little authority to execute, and definitely no executive branch to execute those. As you'll read, a big part of that was, these folks had just overthrown a king who had supreme executive power, royal power, and they were very wary of creating a strong executive branch. You'll read that the states, as they're starting to create their state constitutions, go out of their way to make sure that the executive branch powers are subservient to those of the legislative branch. So under the Articles, pretty much all the national government consisted of was the Congress, the legislative branch. And this is going to raise some problems. So under the Articles, Congress can raise armies, Congress can declare war, Congress can sign treaties, but you basically have no power to raise money, so none of these powers make any difference, because if you don't have money, you can't raise an army, for instance. Also, Congress couldn't regulate trade between the states and other countries. Basically, you have 13 different economies instead of one national economy. And that proved to be pretty difficult to create wealth. Okay, at the same time, I mentioned Spain, but Spain owns this huge empire still in the West, including what's now being called Louisiana, and that gives them control over the Mississippi River, which is really significant because these American 13 states are now pushing toward, they now control area up to the Mississippi River. They're going to want the Mississippi River because they want to move their trade up and down. So the fact that Spain is putting pressure on the Americans and limiting their access to the Mississippi is a big national problem. And here is the organization of that new territory that had been claimed by multiple states, as you can see. So Massachusetts thought its border went all the way to the Mississippi River, as did Connecticut, as did New York. There were a few states that were shut off. South Carolina had no more imaginary border. It could extend all the way to the Mississippi. So anyways, to organize all this, these states needed to all agree. And in fact, until they all came to an agreement, the Articles of Confederation were sort of inoperable. Something that's developing during this time that you'll read about is the abolition movement, and this is where the issue of slavery begins to be an issue of geography. States in the North are going to start emancipating, abolishing slavery essentially. So these states here, their new constitutions, slavery is not allowed. These states here starting to emancipate over time. And then significantly, the Old Northwest. So this is an area created by the Articles Congress. And when they create the Northwest Territory, they forbid slavery in this area. Now, this will become these 4 states that you can see here, but at the time, it's called the Unorganized Northwest Territory. And then to get a feel for how the slave issue will play out, you can see over time, and we start here in 1821, I'll run it through again. This map goes up to 1861, which is the year the fighting breaks out during the Civil War, which is a direct result of what's now starting to happen. You can see how slavery as a practice becomes very geographic. The North has abolished slavery here in 1861, and now here we are back in 1789 with the beginning of the country. And you can see it take this very geographic turn. And that's where we book also goes into Republican society. How are what kind of people are we going to be in this new republic? Interestingly, this is right before you'll read next week about the Industrial Revolution and how that changes everything. So when the country's founded, we're a very agrarian society, which means most people are farmers. 90% of the people, maybe 85 to 90% of all people are connected to the farm, whether they are a farmer or a farmer's wife or a farmer's kid. They will probably be farmers when they grow up, but all that begins to change within 25 to 50 years. The Industrial Revolution changes all that, and many people move away from the farms to take new jobs, and we become an urban society, meaning people live in the cities. So that's all about to change, but at the beginning of the Republic, it was like, okay, who's going to have what roles in society? And women's roles were essentially limited to being a good wife and mother. The role of a woman in this new society, remember, this is the people rule here, so it's supposed to be, popular consent of the governed. But what we actually have is the man of the household basically speaks for everyone in his family, including his wife. So no political power vested with women. Women instead are expected to be good mothers and raise good young sons who will then grow up to be good citizens. It's called Republican motherhood. And that's sort of the role that women are put into. They also, the law recognizes or doesn't recognize women as a separate being under the law from her husband. I mean, this is a very literal concept within the law that won't begin changing in the United States till the 1830s into the 40s and the 50s. Until that time, a woman is seen as having no legal existence outside of her husband. Her husband's legal identity covers her, and that's why it's called the law of coverture. At the same time, though, there are people starting to talk about, equality for women. This is probably considered the first widely read publication that argued that women are entitled to equal rights, by Mary Wollstonecraft, right around 1780. And the basis of her argument is, look, if you treat women equally, they'll be equal in all ways. Like, the only reason women aren't seen as equal is because we don't get the same opportunities that men do, specifically the opportunity to get a good education. Okay, and then something occurs among former soldiers who they feel they're being mistreated. Their mortgages are being called in. They're paying heavy state taxes. This occurs in Western Massachusetts among a bunch of farmers who get really fed up of foreclosures that are happening on their lands and other economic strife, and they rise up, and the Massachusetts militia has to come in to put down this rebellion. And what it shows is that the federal government, the national government, the Articles government just simply wasn't strong enough to deal with problems like Shays' Rebellion when it broke out. And so everyone agrees the Articles aren't working out. This same year, 1787, beginning in May, each of the states, except Rhode Island, sends a delegation to Philadelphia, back to Philadelphia, where the Declaration was written just about 20 years earlier. I'm sorry, just about 10 years earlier. Now they're gathering again. They want to fix the Articles of Confederation. So when they first gather in Philadelphia, they're not going there to write a new constitution. What they're going there to do is to fix the Articles of Confederation. What they end up doing is writing a brand new constitution. And that's the Constitution of 1787, the U.S. Constitution we're under today. The convention was presided over by George Washington, who was obviously a war hero in the early country. Everyone loved George Washington, which is why he becomes the only president to be unanimously elected by the Electoral College after the Constitution is passed. But it's really this guy here, James Madison, who will also turn out to be a third president of the United States, who's he's the brains behind the Constitution. He's the one that puts this Constitution together. So pay attention to that stuff. Keep in mind, this is the Constitution that we still live under today. It's been amended 27 times, I want to say. The first of those 10 amendments were the Bill of Rights. So what's going to happen after the Constitution is written? It's going to be given out to the states, and it goes into effect as soon as 9 of the 13 states ratify it. They'll basically begin a new government under the Constitution. But not everybody likes the Constitution. It's not a perfect document. It made a lot of compromises over slavery, over geography, over political power. So read all about that stuff because those are important compromises to know about. But so there's a big debate in the country over yes Constitution or no Constitution. Each state has to hold a ratifying convention of some sort to determine whether or not it's going to have the Constitution or it's going to ratify. So that's taking place all over. Some states really are gung-ho about the Constitution and jump on board right away, like Delaware and Georgia. Both of those states had real reasons to want a new kind of stronger government. Other states aren't so sure, like New York. New York's a very wealthy, powerful, populous state. Why should it be saddled with all these backwater countries in such a way? States, but they're essentially foreign countries. So the debate is between the Federalists who like the Constitution, Anti-Federalists who are against it. And that debate is probably strongest in a state like New York. And that's why Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay produce a whole bunch of articles for the New York newspapers to push for the Constitution, arguing in favor of the Constitution. Those articles become known as the Federalist Papers. And one of the big arguments against the Constitution is it had no list of citizens' rights, say a right to free speech or a right to bear arms or a right to a jury trial, etc., etc. So that's why, and Madison eventually agreed, yes, a Bill of Rights is necessary. So that's why after ratification occurs in 1789, the new government begins, and one of the first orders of the new government is to create a Bill of Rights. 10 amendments that are almost immediately in 1791 are added to the Constitution. So that's chapter 8, and then chapter 9 is going to go into the beginning of the government and the War of 1812. So enjoy this week's reading.